Babble with Ben.
This podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be participating today.
This is Babble with Ben. I'm David from Studio Brushpen, filling in today to interview a very special guest. He's a musician, producer, technical wizard and podcaster. We've been friends for more than 20 years, and it's my pleasure to say welcome to the Babble, Ben Charlie Brown.
G'day, Dave.
Oh, thanks for coming in, mate.
Thank you for coming in, mate.
We are absolutely trying something different today. Obviously, if you have seen or heard Babble with Ben before, you're familiar with the podcast. Ben interviews musicians and people from different fields of artistic excellence. And he's been doing it for 1 year. So, Ben, you've coming up on the 1 year anniversary. This episode is actually going to be the start of what we're calling season 2.
Yeah. So, look, it's kind of strange. I look back and I'm like, oh, yeah, there's 26 episodes so far. This is going to be number
Amazing.
27.
It's a real achievement.
And it's funny because it's one of those things where I had a Tai Chi teacher years and years ago, right? And he was like, a discipline is like laying a piece of paper down on a desk every day, right?
Okay.
You put down one piece of paper, it doesn't feel very thick, right? You put down 20, it starts to feel like something. You put down 300 and all of a sudden you've got something, right? So it's much like that with this podcast too. It's like, oh, you do one or two, it's all right. But by the time you've got to 25, right? It starts to feel like, oh, yeah, okay, this is a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously over this past year, you've started to build a bit of an audience for the podcast. You've got more of your community involved. We're recording here at Box Hill TAFE and you've interviewed quite a few fellow students and musicians here. But I thought what we might do to give people a bit more of an introduction to yourself, because you're always introducing people, let's go back a bit and learn a bit about you. So let's start at the beginning. Who are you and where are you from?
Oh, look, I am from a little town called Melbourne, which is in Victoria, of course, and it's about halfway to Ballarat. Look, I grew up there in the 80s and 90s, and it to this day it has a reputation as a rough town, right? But I was in the nice bit of the rough town, so...
Okay.
And so, look, I think as far as who I am, that's a very broad question, but I think that I definitely am enjoying this part of my life where I can comfortably say I'm a musician. I feel like I've been a musician. Look, I first picked up a guitar when I was 19, right? So a little bit late. Like it trips me out that I started playing guitar when I was older than a lot of these students that are starting now, right?
Sure.
But I was always, a very keen fan of karaoke, and it got to a point, right, where I was like, okay, I'm spending all my spare cash on music gear, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not calling myself a musician. Why don't I, try, applying myself to this? So
Yeah.
So I think, I've tried being a lot of things, right? But being a musician, I think, is the best fit for me at the moment.
Excellent. And that's nice to be able to come to that after a journey of, your life so far. I'd really like to know, do you come from a musical family? Are there musicians in your family? Or did you grow up listening to music with your family or playing music?
My first guitar was actually from my mother.
Okay.
But I've never seen her play it. I think she maybe had it for a little while when she was in teachers' college.
Okay.
Dad has played bass in bands before.
Mm-hmm.
And he, my first electric guitar I borrowed from him as well. But I never really learned a lot from him. I was definitely more getting tabs off Ultimate Guitar or something back in the 2000s. And I was a big, I have a lot of tab books on my shelf as well. So,
Okay.
But I think YouTube now is where I learn a lot of stuff. And of course at uni as well. Like, I think uni is very good for, I might learn a song by watching it on YouTube, but to have the platform to perform it and get the feedback on the performance is where university is very, very good.
Okay, cool. So you've kind of taken your musical knowledge from other sources of education. Was there music in the home when you were growing up?
Yes.
Did you listen to a lot of music?
Yeah. So I definitely was listening to Dad's Led Zeppelin CDs and Jimi Hendrix as well. I never really had a lot of pocket money as a kid, and so occasionally I've talked about a Prodigy CD that I really loved on the podcast before. Played that a lot, but I think when I started torrenting music, maybe in the early 2000s, that's when I could get those really underground tastes.
Sure.
Especially like psychedelic trance is a big influence of mine. Same with like techno and house as well. And I find that when the internet came along, right, all of a sudden you weren't relying on the radio or, you might remember going down Burke Street Mall in the early 2000s, you'd have, I think, Sanity,
HMV.
and HMV. And
Yes.
you could go and sit there and you'd have a listen to all these different CDs and with headphones on, right? And then when all of a sudden you could do that in your own home and keep it, that was, of course, the precursor to things like Spotify and YouTube, right?
Sure.
But for a while there, you would be getting access to, like early demos of bands and weird remixes that you'd only get in Japan. And that was where I think, my musical tastes really started to expand.
Okay. And do you feel like there was any correlation between that underground music you were into and then that journey to see yourself as a musician? Were there little feelers that you wanted to put out based on things that you'd heard? Or did that come later?
Definitely, because I think when I produce stuff, I take a lot of that underground, that underground feeling, with Suburbia, which we put out last year, right?
Yes.
A lot of that, it was a mainstream sort of retro sounding track, but I'd take little things like a bass line or something that which would have an underground sort of feeling to it as well. And so I find that, I think the goal for what I like is sort of not quite cynical, but subversive music, It's like, cool, it might be, like sort of straightforward music, but there'll always be a little twist with it. So
Okay. Is there anyone in particular that springs to mind when you try to describe that? Like a particular artist or particular bands that you thought, I really like that flavor, or when you say that influence, that cynical kind of thing, or
I'm just trying to think of who was the sort of the best example of that. I think I might have to get back to you on that one, but there are examples of people that make pop music, which is, Devo is the classic one, right? Like Devo would make these really catchy pop tunes, but when you start listening to the lyrics, they're quite subversive, and maybe the same with the Smiths as well.
Okay.
The Smiths, the classic thing is, it's upbeat, jangled music, right?
Yep.
That when you listen to the lyrics, they're really quite dark as well. And I think that was maybe it's not just a 90s thing. I think it's still done to this day, but I think that's the way I like it. It's sort of the song sort of winks at you.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. Can find something if you're paying attention to more than just the surface level.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Layers. I do like
Yeah.
layers and things, right?
Yeah. And sometimes, it's really easy to get a message across beating people over the head with it. But if you have a layer underneath, then it's a little reward for the people who are paying attention, I think. Like whether it's in a songwriting or, in a novel or a film or something like that, it's possible for there to be, a layer underneath the most obvious thing, perhaps.
I think Pixar does that particularly well. When
Sure,
you look at Pixar
yeah,
films, there's
yeah.
always something for the kids, something for the parents, and something for the grandparents, right?
Yeah. And maybe
As you get along,
maybe also for the people who are fans of Pixar films, that they put those little Easter eggs of like props or characters from previous films into the background in something, and you're like, oh yeah, if you didn't notice it, it wouldn't matter at all. But if you did notice it, then it's a nice little reward for being along for the ride and paying attention to stuff. So to see that in songwriting as well is always interesting when you listen to an album as a whole and you hear a little flavor or a little flourish from something that had been in a song earlier in the album, and you go, oh yeah, I did notice that. So yeah, pretty cool. So okay, so we've set up basically, some early days, some influences in music and, kind of growing up in the country. Well, obviously the next thing is you moved to the big city. You moved to Melbourne to come to uni, and that's when we met.
Exactly, yeah.
More than 20 years ago. But Ben, you weren't studying music the first time round at uni. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what you did first time you came down to Melbourne for uni?
Yes, certainly. So I am definitely a computer nerd. Like
Okay.
I remember when I was young, Dad brought home a computer. I think he was ahead of the curve, right?
Okay.
We had a 286 computer, I think, in the late 80s. And I remember playing Frogger and Space Invaders and
Okay.
all sorts of cool stuff on it, right? And I remember being quite panicked one day when I accidentally thought I'd deleted a whole bunch of games, but I'd just deleted like the shortcut on the menu for it. So Dad was luckily able to restore those and I wasn't in too much trouble. But I think that love of computers from my childhood led me to studying IT at Deakin. And I, of course, was staying on campus at Monash with yourself.
Yep.
And we were both at Deakin as well, right? And so I was studying not straight up computer science, but something called multimedia because I always was attracted to that the creativity aspect of it.
Yeah, sure.
And so I thought that I would do that. And I found that, it was a strange mixture of things because on one side you would have, programming with C# or not C#, C++ back in the day. Back in the day. Yeah, we'd have a book with a floppy disk with all the examples in it.
Oh.
But those were the subjects that I kind of hated, that and SQL databases. I really hated. But what I found myself being drawn to were the more creative classes, like, for example, the graphic design classes I really loved.
Sure.
One of my favourite classes, that I remember quite fondly to this day were the video production classes where we would go and shoot it on, like I think it was a Hi8 or something with a Firewire cable that we had to...
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it would play the tape and digitise it as it goes along, right? And then we would use a Media 100 system, right?
Oh, Media 100. So sorry for the young people paying attention right now, but Media 100 was one of the early digital video editing systems, and we had a designated computer for that when we were at uni. These days, of course, you can edit video on your phone, but man, back then you literally had to digitize a videotape into the computer before you edited what you were doing. But it was fun. And for us, it was pretty exciting to be able to do something that wasn't just start and stop on a videotape and edit that way. So it gave a kind of a little window into the future.
Well, that was
that
was the other option, wasn't it? Like if you weren't using the Media 100 system, which of course would be considered, a precursor to something like today's iMovie or
absolutely.
If you could know how to use iMovie, you would have adapted to a Media 100 system pretty quickly, right? But the other option was, of course, to have the two tape decks, right?
Yeah.
And so you'd queue up the part that you want. And then I think you had a couple of transitions you could program into it.
So bad.
It was, look, I imagine it was a step up from cutting the films and splicing them, right?
Because we did that as well.
I didn't do that
maybe
one.
You
that
didn't,
would have
but
been
in
cool.
the film course we did. Yeah, absolutely. On the old Steenbeck, literally cutting and then sticky taping the two pieces of film together. But as you said, the video editing was like one step above that, where you had the two tapes kind of in the same machine and you could queue it up to record and stop. But it was about half a second either way, whether it actually matched. So it wasn't always the most accurate. Okay, so you started getting a bit of an interest in not just the technical stuff, but a little bit more of the creative stuff while we were at uni.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. I never finished that degree. I dropped out of that degree. I quite honestly, I had some battles with my mental health when I was in my early 20s.
Okay.
There was a time, where I basically withdrew from the world for the best part of 6 months. I was just living at mum and dad's place, not seeing anyone, fairly down and out. But I wasn't working at the time, but it got to a point where I was like, okay, I'm sick of being at home. I'm sick of being broke. I went out and got, the most menial call center job you could get. I think it was the first proper job I had was as a telemarketer.
Okay.
As a telemarketer.
Okay.
When I think about it in this day and age, it almost seems madness because what I would do is I'd sit down in a call center. We would have a list of people and their numbers, right? We would call them up and we would say, oh, hey, we're not asking for money, but would you like to take a book of raffle tickets and sell it for a charity, right? And they would go, oh, yeah, we'd love to do that. And I think where the money started coming in was we would say, okay, cool, well, look, we'll send it out to you. Do you want to pay for the book ahead of time, right? So that, we've got our money, right? And they would often go, oh, yeah, cool, we'll do that. And they would actually read out their credit card numbers, right?
Yes.
To a complete stranger that had cold called them during their dinner, right?
Right.
It didn't happen very often, but you think about it now and you think about the amount of credit card scams that are going on now. It was a more innocent time, I think, when people would give out their credit card numbers to strangers, and the strangers would be doing the right thing too. Like we weren't. If we were scammers, it was a low-grade scammer. Like it was kind of like raffle tickets.
Call centres full of scammers in some other country, kind of piggybacking off a mobile number that may show up on your screen. But of course, that was in an age where people would just pick up the phone because you couldn't see who was calling. So you picked up the phone because it was ringing, right? So
phones were on the wall and they had a cable.
It was a different time.
Yeah, it was a different time. Oh, don't we sound like old fogies?
Totally. But as we were just saying before we started recording, that you and I have lived through the transition period of a number of technologies, right? That, we kind of came up in an age where home computers were becoming more prevalent, that the internet became a thing that people could use in their homes. We went to uni kind of pre-smartphone and pre-social media.
Yes.
A lot of our experiences in our early 20s were pre-social media. So, the only record we have of it is photos we took or the memories that we have. We don't have that, always online, always forever, digital copy of our lives living in the cloud. I find that very comforting, actually. So, I think to share the memories together is a big part of it. Okay, so, we've kind of transitioned past the uni phase and you had a call center job and doing that kind of thing. There's a bit of a gap after study and you're in the working world for a while. Now, I didn't write this down, but I'm wondering, did you study audio production after that as well?
Oh, yeah. So what happened after I got the telemarketing job, right, is that eventually segued into a tech support job for Telstra, right?
Right, okay.
Inbound, like people, it was originally for the dial-up tech support line.
Sure.
And so it was quite funny because people would ring on their landline, we'd get them to try all these different bits and pieces, right? And then they'd have to hang up and test it because, of course, you can't, it sounds like madness. It's like, when I was a kid, you couldn't have a phone call and be on the internet at the same time.
Yes.
It was just so funny. And so moving on from that, right, I then went into, from Telstra, I then went into a series of tech support jobs for smaller companies, right?
Okay.
And it eventually culminated in a job where I was working full-time, but then I got a redundancy, right? And so when I got that redundancy, I suddenly found myself with a little bit of a financial buffer. And as I was explaining earlier, right, the whole time I was working, right, I was always, buying musical bits of equipment,
Sure.
building a computer that you could record audio into. And I was like, I'm spending a lot of time doing this. I was doing karaoke at the same time too. And I think the light bulb moment was I was reading some self-help book, right? I'm just trying to think what it was. It might have been getting things done or something like that. I'll put a link in that when I finish this off, right? There was a nugget of gold there which said, if you think about what you want to do, if you didn't have to get paid, right, what would you do? And I thought, I'd love to be a musical performer, but I had no experience performing, right?
Okay.
I'd done, karaoke, maybe some busking, right?
Okay.
And I thought, okay, well, here I am. I've got a brain for computers, right? But I'd love to be a performer, right? What is the middle ground between that? And I thought, production, because production is, of course, the synergy of music and computers.
It's the intersection. Yeah, absolutely.
And so I went to, and I had a look around, and so I actually did start this course before I got the redundancy, right? It was maybe like a month or two, so the timing was excellent. But I found a part-time evening course doing music production at what is now Melbourne Polytechnic, but was NMIT in that day.
NMIT, that's the name I was kind of reaching for in my memory. Okay. And how long did you do that for?
That was 2 years part-time in the evenings, right?
Right.
It's so funny because it's actually it's either next to or was on an old asylum, and I'm like, oh yeah, it still feels like an asylum. But it was my first experience of being immersed in the music industry, right?
Sure.
And I really, really liked it because I remember there was one time we were walking through the campus, right? And there was a choir rehearsing somewhere, and I was like, oh yeah. I'm in the right spot.
Yeah.
And so, of course, NMIT was great because we were taught how to use GarageBand. We were taught how to use Logic and Pro Tools.
Wonderful.
Reason, all that sort of stuff, how to, use a studio and how to do a bit of mixing. And so from there, I think I had a year or two off, and then I went and did... So that was a diploma at NMIT, and then I went on to do an advanced diploma at... maybe it was a Cert 3 and 4 at NMIT. I can't remember. But then I went and did an advanced diploma at RMIT, and that felt like I loved NMIT, but RMIT did feel like the next level, right?
A bit more solid.
Well, it was more competitive to get into, and it also had some really good studios, and I think it was more focused on industry placement as well, because we did a lot of sort of like
Right.
syncing sound effects to ads and that sort of stuff, right?
Sure.
So that was definitely the next step in my journey for that. Now, after that, it got a bit crazy because, as you may or may not know, if you are doing these creative fields, right, it's not like you can walk into a business with your degree and say, hey, I've got a degree. And
boy.
You've really got to sort of make your own way there.
Yeah.
And so for a little while, I was like, oh, okay, well, look, I've got all these skills, but I'm not using them and I've got to bring some bucks in, right? And so I did actually start my own IT repairs business, right?
Right, yeah.
And then, look, there's no secret that thoroughly burnt me out. Like I did that, I was, had employees, all sorts of stuff for 2 years. And at the end of it, I'm like, oh, miserable. And so I wrapped the whole thing up. I still do some consulting for people. That's my bread and butter now is helping the best people from that business, right?
Sure.
But then I got to that point where it's like, okay, well, look, what do I really want to do? And I'm like, oh, I love singing. And so I started the path at Box Hill.
Yeah. And it feels like telling this story of all those steps, you're just getting closer and closer to that, that idea of yourself as a musician, that idea of yourself being able to do it. It's great that, you have that IT or tech services kind of thing to be able to, as you say, the bread and butter, pay the rent kind of thing. With that, is it a different aspect of your personality? Do you think that there's similar aspects to them, or do you see yourself as like a different person when you're helping people with their tech problems compared to doing production and music stuff like that?
I think that the main takeaway I can get from this path into music that I've been taking, right, is to live in the moment more.
Okay.
And I think that if I compare myself to, the Ben of 2016, right, who was stressed and not living in the sort of not in his own head. He's in his own head. But when I was in 2016, it wasn't. I wasn't in the moment. I wasn't relaxed. I wasn't comfortable. And I think if you are working with someone, you can tell if they're not comfortable, right? You can, your interactions are more forced. People are more guarded, right? I find that I am more relaxed with my IT clients now that I'm doing this thing that really fulfills my, emotional needs, right? Whereas before I'd just be going through the motions and not giving it my all, right? Like not having the utmost empathy for the people that I'm working for, right? And so I think ironically doing something away from IT has made my IT skills better.
It's given you some space to do it. And and of course, now you've done it for so long, you get to choose your clients as well. So, maybe you're more inclined to have a good relationship with those individual people that you're taking care of. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like when the thing that I find is probably the most obvious indicator, right, is that I've now got a mullet, right? And to a certain age group, a mullet can be a sort of controversial thing, right?
Okay.
But I'm finding that all my clients, they might have a bit of a laugh at it, but they're not it's not preventing them from calling me back to help them
Right.
out, right?
Okay,
Like they sort
okay.
of, and there was a big thing I was reading about this where if you can have the comfort to express yourself like that, like, I mean, like it is a silly haircut, right? Like I got it because it's a silly haircut, right?
Sure.
People can tell that you're perhaps more relaxed and that you're more comfortable with who you are, and they feel more relaxed and more comfortable
Okay.
as well. And so, whereas when I was doing my business, I was I was running it in Toorak, which is of course a bit
Yes.
of a wealthy, affluent
Yep.
suburb in Melbourne, right?
Yep.
And I definitely had the very typical millennial look, right?
had the
Which was,
short
of course,
hair.
short, clippered beard,
Beard.
fades on the sides,
Yep.
a little
I
bit of hair
remember.
on the top. Yeah.
Yep.
And
Yep.
it was, very typical look. And look, I did like the look and it was easy enough to pull off. But I find that I am expressing myself more now, right? And again, that all comes back from doing something that you love that is good for you, right? And so... And I think you were right in picking out that it's certainly not an overnight journey and it was planned out. But I think if I can give some inspiration to other people that are not happy where they are today, right?
Yep.
And but they have a solid vision of where they want to be, right? It's that don't be afraid if it takes 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, right?
Yeah.
The longer you wait for it, the better it is sometimes,
And I suppose that comes full circle to the layers of paper slowly forming something solid, right? I suppose that really does bring up an interesting aspect to your life that maybe not everyone has experienced, is that you're studying now 20 years since you were first a university student. So how is studying now different to when you were in your 20s? Like, obviously you're a different person, but are there aspects to it that you notice or appreciate more now than you might not have even clocked back then?
In some ways, it's a lot easier. In some ways, it's a bit harder.
Okay.
The time constraints about having to, run a household and run a business, right?
Sure.
I do admit that I get very, very envious of someone that can sit at their parents' house with a couple of days' work a week, right? Who can then spend the rest of that time practicing, right? And I'm just like,
Okay.
yeah. I do get envious of that. But in the other, on the flip side, right, one of the advantages, right, is that I feel like I'm better at managing my time now. Like, if you look at my phone, right, it is like mapped out, color coded, right, all my different appointments, right?
Okay.
Because of course, if you're running your own business, right, people will get tired of you if you turn up half an hour late to an hour appointment consistently, right?
Sure.
And so I'm always like, yep, here's the person's name, here's the address, here's their phone number, right? And, it's in there so I can look at it the night before and just go, okay, cool. Well, I've got so-and-so in South Yarra. I've got then another person in Fitzroy and then another person, in Toorak afterwards. And I can sort of plot it out, right? And whereas when I was 18 at Deakin, right? I didn't even have a paper diary. Like I was kind of just going off my memory going, oh yeah, I think on Tuesdays I've got this subject at this room. And and there's the classic thing where you get double booked, right? Like let's say, you commit to 2 different friends at the same time, right?
Sure.
It's even worse when it's a client, right? Like when you, yeah. And so that's an advantage I think from coming in as a mature age student. And I think also as a mature age student, I can sort of, I don't know, I don't think intimidate is the right word, but if I have a disagreement with a tutor, I feel like the footing is more even because I am closer to their age. And in fact, there are a couple of teachers here that I am older than, right? And so, if I've got a disagreement, I have to make sure I don't get my grey beard, middle-aged man sort of attitude happening going, well, look, actually, I don't think that's the way it should be done. And so, but it is an advantage, right? Because there have been times where I've had to discuss with the university about fees, and having learnt to stand up for myself as a business owner over money, right? I think that is an advantage. Whereas 18-year-old me would have been like, oh, well, it's on help, it's a loan, oh, that's a problem for the future. Whereas now I'm like, no, that's real money. I'm going to have to pay that back someday.
Yeah.
And I get my sort of, I get my Karen look at me. And I'm just like, yeah, all right, cool. This is unacceptable. And so, yeah, those are sort of the disadvantages and the advantages of being a mature age student. I mean, it is a bit strange knowing that a lot of these students are half my age, and but I think now that I've been here since 2018, right?
Okay.
I'm used to it now. I'm used to
Sure.
it now. Like and I think I have learned a lot from the younger generation as well. Like, I've got TikTok, and I'm laughing at all the Maxwell the cat memes and things that if I had never opened up TikTok and I looked at it as a 41-year-old, I would have been like, what's this black and white cat like spinning around on top of a building? Like,
What's going on?
oh, and
So
then,
you've had that element of youth around you as well.
Yeah.
Then. And of course, we've mentioned it a couple of times. We're not as young as we once were when we were first students, but to have that, kind of social group with amongst your other students, right, that are also young and energetic and bringing that new perspective to maybe things that you had thought you might have left behind. I think that's a positive thing.
absolutely.
Yeah. And what is it that you enjoy about being a student and a musician here, do you think?
I think that it's just being immersed in the culture.
Great.
As we all know, COVID was a huge thing, right? And it disrupted the music industry, including the music education industry, quite severely, right? Because it was all of it. A big part of a music performance degree is performing, right? And for this idea that it was dangerous to, get into groups and perform indoors, right?
Yeah.
Was a huge thing, right? And so I have taken 5 years to do a 3-year degree. I've probably got another 1 or 2 years left.
Sure.
But my strategy was that during COVID, I would continue studying, right? Because I love it, right?
Yeah.
But I would deal with the more academic subjects, right? So music theory was one thing.
Right.
Music business was another thing.
Right.
All the things that, like history and that sort of stuff, right? All the things that you could do via Zoom and, write the lectures up, right? And so I've been doing that now. It trips me out because COVID, of course, really became a big problem, let's say halfway through 2020, right? Like maybe a quarter of the way through 2020, right? And so that is now 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
So in the space that it's taken my friends to do their entire degree, right, I've really only done 1 or 2 performance subjects. I've done all the academic subjects, right? But now, in much the same way that if I've got a roast dinner in front of me, right, like I'll eat, the roast. I will eat the peas first and the corn first, right, and then I'll have the potato and then I'll have the roast part, right? I've gone and dealt with all the stuff that I'm not so
You've
passionate
nibbled around
about,
the
right?
edges. Yeah.
And then I've just left all the juicy stuff, all the performance stuff is now ahead
we
of
are.
me, and I'm still sort of kind of realizing it, going,
Yeah.
I've only got fun stuff to do now. And
That's great.
It's just sort of sunk in this week. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm going to be on stage every week and I'm going to be performing with people. This is kind of like the dream. And I'm not distracted by, figuring out, like, how do I modulate into that key from, A flat, and how do I do it in a tasteful way? Oh, where do I put that, sharp 9, chord?
Yeah.
It's like, this is it. This is the part. And so to circle back to the question, right?
Yeah.
This year I'm really like, we're only a week into it, right? But already I can feel like, this is the stuff. This is the crystallization of all the disciplines we've been learning, right?
Yep.
This is the part where you evolve as a performer.
Fantastic. Absolutely. And I can see that as you've been talking about that, like maybe more than anything else we've talked about today, I can see that passion in your face, which is just so cool. Well, let me ask you then, how do your friends and family feel about you and your music career, like as it is now? Because obviously you've come a long way since, basically trying some things at uni and working in the working world for a number of years. Do friends and family have an opinion about what you're doing?
Oh, yeah, a lot of people do ask me how the music's going. I mean,
Yeah.
they sort of laugh now that it's been going on for so long, but I think everyone understands that, COVID made things, take a little
course.
bit longer.
Yeah.
Mum and Dad talk about things. I think Mum and Dad talk about the podcast more than they talk about the music, right?
Okay.
I think Mum and Dad come from a perspective where they just want to make sure that there's dollars coming in. And of course, everyone knows that the music industry, it's a slog at the bottom, right?
Right.
And so, of course, that's why I keep the day job. I mean, being self-employed and studying part-time,
Yep.
it means that I've got a very flexible schedule, right?
Yep.
So that keeps on coming in. But I think most people are very supportive because most people, I think, understand that you need that thing that lights your soul up, right? That
Sure.
thing that really
Absolutely.
fulfills you, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, I think people that don't have something they really enjoy are not as easy to deal with. You know,
Yeah.
people that feel like they're missing out are not as easy to deal with. And I look, there were times where one of the things that really pushed me into music, right, was that when I was working in IT, right, I would see people on stage and I would get insanely jealous. I'd be like,
Okay.
I'd just be like, oh, they're flat, oh, their guitar's no good. I'd be like hating on them, right? And I realized that it's not anything to do with them. It was all about my unfulfilled needs.
Right.
And so now I think maybe I'm more sympathetic to that in others. It's like, oh, okay, cool. You know, like if you're not understanding why this person needs to do it, then that maybe because it's an unfulfilled need that they have, right?
Sure.
So, so I think in general though, like most people are very supportive, and and I think I've met interesting people as a result too. So like it's very nice when you are in a group of people that are there deliberately, right, rather than by
Yes,
circumstance, right?
absolutely,
Like,
yeah.
high school's the classic one. It's like, you're all there because you're born in this suburb, right? And a lot of workplaces too. It's like, okay, well, you've all got this interest, like you've all got a need for money, right? Whether you're there because you're passionate about the particular business you work for, more often than not, it's kind of like,
And they're just the people you spend the most part of your week with as well.
it's insane, isn't it?
Yeah. I tell you what, that's really interesting that you mentioned that your parents comment maybe more on the podcast than they do on the music itself. And I suppose that's because you've been doing the podcast for a year. It's a tangible thing that people can see you making progress on, whereas whatever you're doing at school when they don't see you is maybe a little more ephemeral, right? So maybe let's bring it round full circle. Let's talk about Babble with Ben, the podcast. You're recording it here at Box Hill TAFE, where you're also a student. Maybe talk a little bit about how the podcast started.
Well, the podcast actually came as a result of a music business subject that we were doing at the start of last year.
Right.
And in the very first class, we were talking, it was such a strange class because it was a music business class, and I was there with Jason from J Atlantic. Hey, Jason. And we were asked by the teacher to think of think of a problem that your fellow students are having, right?
Okay.
And there were all sorts of things, right? But the one thing that popped up the most, right, was that people are making this music, they're making all these great things, right? But they then only, have their friends and family see it, right? There's no platform, for beginning students, right?
Yeah.
To share it to a wider audience, right?
Sure.
And so I thought, oh, okay, well, what if, what can we do with that? And I had been watching a lot of Joe Rogan at the time. I was really getting involved in watching his podcasts and just enjoying the conversations that you'd see with people that had all these really interesting experiences, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, well, look, if I was doing a podcast, right, and I could get, people around school, my friends to come in, that not only gives them a platform, right, but it also builds a community, right? Because
Yes.
I have had people on who, then go and meet other guests of the podcast and like, oh, okay, we've got something in common. We've both been on this podcast or that sort of thing. I mean, I've even formed a band with Parker.
Ben, amazing.
That was really the genesis. The genesis of the podcast was a need that I thought I could fill.
Okay.
That students had sort of identified, right? And then, then it was a matter of sort of making that happen and evolving it from there.
And it has grown beyond just being a class assignment to being, something that involves the community of students around you. But you've had guests from outside Box Hill TAFE as well. You've had guests who are, living and working in Melbourne in the music industry. Of course, you had Alex on, who has written a book, and so you're starting to just spread that community out a little further, which I think is a really positive thing. Let's come back to the band, Strawberry Lipstick. Tell us about that, Ben. So that kind of came about because of the podcast, in a way?
That came about because of the podcast. Yeah, definitely. Because I had made friends with Parker earlier during the year, and I think we were sitting down having dumplings somewhere.
Yeah.
Again, I think Jason was part of it as well. And and so Parker came on the podcast, and then we were hanging out, and he was sort of, itching to form a band, and I was kind of itching to form a band, and I'm like, well, why don't we do like a queer punk band, right? And he was like, yes, let's do that. And so, and then Oak and Jackson came on board, and now Josh is on board, and so it's last year it sort of spins my mind a little bit, because not only did I start the podcast, I got the band together, and we've done a release then. There's just all sorts of things that happened really quickly, I think, at least in part, due to starting the podcast, right?
That's great. That's absolutely fantastic. And you're planning on doing some more with the band, with Strawberry Lipstick this year?
Oh, yes. We've got a live album coming out soon. I'm sitting in front of the computer very diligently, like editing together the videos.
Excellent.
There.
Yep.
So that's going to be called Bloodbath Bazaar. It's a recording of what was actually our very first, live performance in front of an audience.
A piece of history then. For Strawberry Lipstick fans, a piece of history.
It'll be a bit of a curiosity, right? Because there are so many mistakes. There are so many parts where we stuffed up. But I always think of this quote by Dave Grohl from Nirvana and Foo Fighters, among other things,
sure,
right?
Of course.
And he said that when he first started, Nirvana with Kurt and Chris, right? That they would go out there and they would suck, and they knew they sucked.
Okay.
And they were like, oh, this is not good. But they kept on going out there.
Yep.
They kept on sucking, right?
Yep.
But every time they
Yep.
would get that little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. And then all of a sudden, they're the biggest band in the world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not anticipating being the biggest band in the world, right?
No, but you can get better.
But you can always get better.
Yeah.
You can always get better. And there is a saying, again, it comes back to martial arts, right? There is a saying in the martial arts community that the master has failed more times than the student has tried, right?
Okay.
And so if you have 5 shit gigs and 2 good ones, right? That's 2 more good gigs than you would have had, in sitting in the rehearsal room, right?
Sure,
or
sure.
Not being out there doing it,
Yeah.
right? And you learn to be a little bit more insistent about having more fallback as a vocalist. You sort of learn, what works for you
Yeah,
and
what do
what
you
to
need,
avoid.
right?
Yeah.
You need to, obviously, by practically doing a thing, having gigs and sucking in front of a live audience, the things that need fixing, the things that need rehearsing. And
Yes.
as you say, the technical aspects of, the, sound in a room, that's, definitely stuff that, is part of the journey, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think in the modern age too, it's very easy to curate your online presence, right?
Sure.
So that it's
Yeah.
perfect,
Yeah.
like you've got the lighting right, you've got the filters right. Auto-tune, of course, is rampant in the music. Rampant may be a harsh word, but auto-tune is very prevalent in the music industry.
Heavily
right?
used, yeah.
And it can almost feel like that you are listening to auto-tune rather than a singer. You start to understand, that's what this does. It's dragging that note there.
Yeah.
The auto-tune vibrato, I find, like Post Malone, I think is perhaps the most prominent example that comes to my mind, right? It's where it's just perfect. It's like this really precise wobble, right?
Yeah.
But it's not anything that the humans generated, right?
Sure.
Like it's and so when you start hearing everyone using that, people lose their identity. And so one of the principles that I've been insistent on with Strawberry Lipstick, right, is that it's warts and all, right? Like it's if there's mistakes in there, then that's it. That's fine.
Yeah.
I think I like hearing the mistakes occasionally.
Sure.
It's like, it's a real band.
It's real, you're humans.
Yeah.
And there's as little of a barrier between you and the audience as well, right? If they can hear warts and all, the mistakes that you're making, but that you have the energy and the passion and you're ready to go, maybe you'll make a connection that way. Yeah, instead of it being perfect and, easy to slip by like oil across glass or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it does help. I ultimately want it to take the pressure off I wanted it to help people take the pressure off themselves, right? Like,
Sure.
Like Australian Idol, you'd get these, fully, produced performers
Yeah.
just emerging out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
And then people would think, oh, okay, well, I'm not as good as Australian Idol. I'm not as good as these people that are, supposed to be beginners, right? But of course, it's all fake. And so I want to make sure that people know, it's okay. It's okay. Just as long as you're playing the game right,
Yep.
doesn't matter if you win or lose.
That's fantastic. And you're playing some live gigs.
We are looking for live gigs. If
Yes.
you want a little rowdy punk band to play at your venue,
Do it.
we've got to start. One of the things I really want to do this year is start. One of the things I really want to do this year is start building a community, right?
Okay.
Because I think that is vital.
Yes.
In music, right?
Yes.
And so I think it would be lovely to have, a group of people that are all, happy to get gigs together and support
Yes.
each other, right? So that's one of the goals I've got. And even to, I don't know if it's going to happen yet, but I would love to get some venue owners on the podcast too, because I'd love to show beginner musicians, right? These are the steps you can take.
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
if
It's
you
another
wanna-
aspect of that world, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, if you feel like you can get 10 people, to come and watch you, right? Contact these venues.
Yeah.
This is what the terms are, so on and so on, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So whilst we haven't got any gigs planned yet, we certainly are planning to gig.
Absolutely. Well, that sounds like a fantastic year ahead. Congratulations on the podcast.
Thank you.
This is Babble with Ben, of course. So people can find you on YouTube, obviously, at Ben Charlie Brown. Where else can they find you online for your music and other things?
Haven't they already found me?
They've already found you. If you're listening to this, you found the podcast. But you might not also know that Ben, as a producing musician, has some music out there in the world. Can people find that through the same channels?
Yeah, generally my Instagram is the best one.
Excellent.
I'm pretty sure it's ben.charlie.brown. I'll put a link to it, right?
Excellent.
Generally, anything that I've got the slightest whiff of involvement with,
Yep.
I'll put it up there. So whether it's my single, which is going to come out in
Single
April,
coming up.
yeah,
Very good.
there's one. It's called The Way to Yourself. You have very kindly done the artwork for that. So
That
I'm
was
really
a bit of
looking,
fun. Yeah.
really looking for it's a weird thing because it's a cover of a song I did with Suburbia, right? So it's
Yep.
kind of like covering my own song, but it's I'm looking forward to putting that out there. And of course, Strawberry Lipstick does stuff as well. Everything goes through my Instagram, ben.charlie.brown.
That sounds wonderful. And one last thing to add before we wrap up is that you very kindly came on my YouTube channel, that's Studio Brushpen, and joined me for a bit of a drawing game. Studio Brushpen is an art channel, and I do drawing games, short lessons and sketching for all ages. And you very kindly came on and did that. So hopefully, all things being well, we will both have edited our videos, and you'll be able to see that link in the doobly-doo. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on your own show, Babble with Ben. It's Ben Charlie Brown, everybody. Thank you.
And yes, thank you very much, David P. from Studio Brushpen. If you haven't seen Dave's stuff, it really is very good. Like, it's accessible to all ages. I think my favourite one, which is now hanging up on my wall, right, is your Rainbow Lorikeet one. So, and of course, yeah. And if you've seen any of the Suburbia artwork, that's of course Dave's one. And this new one's coming out too. So yeah, check out Dave's stuff. It's really good.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.